Welcome to the SKIP webinar series, and thank you for joining us. It is my pleasure to welcome you to today's program, Trend Monitoring and Analysis, Anticipating Disruption. My name is Lakshika Thrika, and I am Program Manager at the Strategic and Competitive Intelligence Professionals, and I will be your moderator today. Here are some simple guidelines to ensure your experience will be maximized. This is a live webinar, so your computer will show the presentation and stream the audio live. So please ensure that your computer audio is on. All participants will be muted during the duration of the program. There is a Q&A function that will be active during the presentation, enabling you to type your questions to the organizer. Questions will be asked as time permits, and those not answered will be addressed at a later date. We do not foresee technical issues. However, internet programs are sometimes subject to connection issues, so should this happen, we'll contact you regarding rescheduling. Our program today will be presented by Peter Grimm, Managing Director, and Bo Oliver, Director of Business Development at Cipher. With that said, let's get started with today's e-broadcast. Gentlemen, the floor is yours.
Hey, thanks, Lakshika. Good morning, everyone. My name is Bo Oliver, as Lakshika mentioned, and we'll be talking about a lot of these efforts around trend monitoring and analysis today, but specifically more towards the far end of the trend monitoring process, which is getting down into what's actually going to impact your strategy and monitoring and anticipating that disruption. For those of you not familiar with Cipher, we're a consultancy that really focuses on helping organizations to better understand their competitive landscape and really that future market, which is really important. We do this through competitive intelligence services, primary and secondary research. We have our own software platform, and then we obviously do a lot on the consulting piece. From that, both Pete and I do a lot and help many companies and organizations establish these trend monitoring functions. So today we kind of take advantage of that strategy background, walk through, and we want to share a little bit more around some of the more valuable areas of that we've been able to help companies with as we go through. You see both Pete and I have similar backgrounds. We both come from big consulting previously and then have been involved in competitive intelligence and strategy throughout the years as well. Today's focus, as I mentioned, is going to really be around monitoring for disruption and understanding what events, whether they're competitor initiated or market shifts, that could really disrupt your differentiation in the market and change the way that you do business as an organization. It's important to keep in mind that this is really part of a much larger trend monitoring process where you're going to be able to identify, prioritize, and then track these different trends that are going to be affecting your market. I wanted to start off today by kind of walking through just a quick overview of this process to kind of set some context before we move into how we monitor for disruption. So starting off with what is a trend? A lot of times I know Pete is in the same boat, but we talk to organizations and individuals that often have a misunderstanding of the trends that are shaping their environments. For example, I see a lot of articles that come out, the top 5, top 20 trends of 2017. If we asked each of you to line out, what you thought the top trends were affecting your industry, you're going to see a lot of very microeconomic and tactical answers like 3D printing, Internet of Things, some of these other buzzwords that are coming out. I would argue that these are more from our context, these microeconomical or tactical reactions to the trends that are affecting your market. So we'll talk through a little bit of that here first, walk through some of a high-level framework to give you a little bit to take away from this and be able to kind of do the initial piece of starting something like this in your own organization. But in general, what we consider to be a trend, and for the purposes of today, is going to be a general change in the way a market, region, capability, or business is developing. These typically involve a shift or change in an area of interest. And as you see here, I hear a lot of people, we'll use healthcare as an example today when we talk through just to kind of keep a steady theme. But, you always hear people in healthcare tell me, oh, well, we monitor the trends and, health regulations are a big trend that we follow. So for what we're getting at is that, those regulations alone are not a trend. However, the shifts in them and how they're able to do, whether it's reimbursement, movement of outpatient procedures, or other pieces, are really going to be those trends as we go through. I think it's also important to think through why trend monitoring and analysis is important. Today, more than ever, across multiple industries that you're dealing with, innovation, new products, innovative business models, and other areas are really breaking down all of those barriers to entry, where you now see, for example, very established financial institutions that have been around for 200 years that are being disrupted by startups and online banking and lenders that are starting up with less than $5 million and are coming in and disrupting. All the companies you see here on this list were interesting because when they shuttered the doors, they were a market leader within 12 months of the time that they ended up closing down or filing Chapter 11. One of the biggest things that I take away from this is that anticipating these trends is not just a good thing to have, but a requirement, especially in larger organizations, because you don't have the reaction speed of a more small, agile organization to really be able to react quickly to these trends and deal with them. Blockbuster is a great example of that here. Also, one of the other pieces that makes it difficult is, once you're successful, reevaluating that business model that got you there is a very difficult exercise. And then one of my favorite things that we always say is that business as usual often results in little business in the future. Taking it up to more of a strategic level, it's really about better understanding that future market. It's one thing to benchmark against competitors, but at the end of the day, you're now benchmarking to better understand what they did several years ago in some cases that was successful in today's market. So then you need to be able to add on that better understanding of the trends that are going to shape and let you know what that future market will look like and begin to plan accordingly. You see a lot of companies that do the piece on the left here with the incremental planning process. Incremental being you make each decision as it comes. Think of it as a large decision tree. You start off with that initial left or right. Left may be the best option for you at the time, but at the end of the day, if you're going to a future that is far right on that scale, maybe it makes more sense to take that more direct path. And I always tell people it's essentially you're looking across a lake and you're trying to figure out the path of lily pads that you're going to take that's going to get you to where you want to be with the least effort and also cost in that case. So all of this comes together around more of a high-level framework at how you approach trend monitoring and analysis and the steps involved in it. So the pieces that we're going to review here quickly are around the initial trend identification and how that breaks down, how to monitor and analyze, and then even identify potential market opportunities from those as well. Then we'll talk quickly around how you align this around your differentiation and your strategy. This is one of the most important steps, I think, and it's also one of the more difficult exercises within your company to better understand and really dig into what are those 2 to 3 core differentiators that your company has that it needs to monitor against in the market. Then from there, you'll be able to identify and prioritize these potential disruptors, these threats or changes that could fundamentally change the way that you do business and more immediately kind of force you to revise your longer-term strategy that you have in place. Then obviously we'll talk a little bit about assessing and monitoring, and then obviously you want to get into communicating after that. One thing that I think is important to remember is that you'll see at the bottom we have stakeholder engagement and inputs throughout this. The idea from a CI practitioner perspective is not to take on all of this additional responsibility and do this. This could be more than a full-time job for several people as you go. The important piece is to prioritize your efforts based on what you have and then coordinate within that organization to kind of be that CI quarterback to pull all that information together and then pull it in so that you have it. And we'll dig into that a little more later. But I think this is a great framework to kind of focus how you're doing your efforts around trend monitoring and analysis. So digging a little bit into that first step, it's important to kind of what I call rank trends, and I think about this as a big funnel, as you kind of see on the left. You start off with your large macroeconomic trends, or mega trends in this case. I consider these the future market drivers that are working together to shape that market and how it's going to develop in the future. From there, those macro drivers interact and create these macro trends that you see. These resulting trends are the ones that are going to interact to really shape and steer how companies are going to go into that future market. And that's where you get down into the more micro and tactical trends. And these are how companies are going to place their bets to move into those different areas and take advantage of that future market. So these will include different technology needs. These will include different business models and other changes. And this is where we would get into things like a company placing an investment in 3D printing, for example, or robotics. From there, you can identify those potential disruptors once you understand your strategy and how these other companies could make moves or how the market could shift and go a different direction that would impact your strategy and what you've put in place. We'll give an example of some of this here in a little bit because this is one of the harder pieces to really get your head around to start. But if you do this effectively and lay that foundation, it makes your monitoring and analysis that much easier going forward. As we mentioned, the differentiation piece, the reason why I focus on this so much and think that it's so important is for several reasons. One, companies naturally are not good at articulating their differentiation. It almost sounds counterintuitive when you're in the marketplace. But we sit with a lot of companies. One of my favorite things to do is to start off every meeting or strategy session with a quick discussion around differentiation. And you hear a lot of the same things. You hear, oh, you know, our people are the best. Oh, we've got the best processes out there. And other things around this. What companies are talking about when they get into those areas are really more table stakes, right? These are considered the minimum entry requirements to compete in your market. Meaning things like our people are the best. Well, somebody else could pay your people better and cherry pick and pull them away, right? Somebody else could copy your processes and do this. When you really get down into it, what are those core differentiators and that core differentiation that makes you your value proposition for your company? What do you do better than your competition? And then now you have a better idea of what you're going to be worried about defending in that marketplace. And it's important to kind of think through on the right there how it ties into trend monitoring is that this is really designed to help you prioritize your efforts around trend monitoring and analysis. You obviously apply a higher priority to those trends and shifts that will have the greater impact on that differentiation that you've identified. So this really, if done right, becomes the core foundation of your trend monitoring and analysis efforts. I also always joke companies go in thinking that they're going to have 8 or 9 of these. You know, most even very large companies will sometimes walk out of an exercise like that with only 1, maybe 2 key differentiators, which to me just, you know, more solidifies the importance of this, that if you're only working with 2 core differentiators, then you really have to understand how to protect that and to monitor how others are going to be coming after or trying to duplicate that differentiation. So from there, all of these interact and come out, and you're able to start identifying these differentiators and then prioritize them. Again, you've got finite resources in your organization. Everybody's got more work than they can already tackle. How do you pull that in and start prioritizing this as part of your efforts as you go through? So from our perspective, it's really important to prioritize based on several factors. The first and foremost being the probability of occurrence. Right? What is the probability that this is actually going to happen? The next being the severity of impact. You know, which of these disruptors is going to have the biggest potential impact on the way that we do business? And then the one that's often overlooked is the timing, right? You could have something that has a very high probability of occurrence and is very severe impact on your organization, but it may not be happening for 20 years because they don't have the resources, the technology is not available yet, whatever the case is, and then that would drop it down on your priority list. So good to prioritize them and understand how they're going to impact your organization as a whole. And then kind of a quick and dirty example just to pull all that together before we get into more of how do you monitor these disruptors and protect that differentiation. A good example here from health. We do some work with different companies. One that we'll pull a little bit of examples into today, but in the ear, nose, and throat area. So in this example, you've got your mega trends, which these are 3 of about 8 that were identified. So you've got a shift to value-based healthcare, meaning that you're selling more on total value versus cost of a specific device or cost of a specific procedure. This includes, anything from rates of having people that have to come back in, rates of infection, things of that nature, the overall value for what you have versus the cost of the individual procedure. At that same time, you've also got cost pressures, right? Everybody's looking for a cheaper alternative as you go through in this future market. And then you also have the evolving stakeholder landscape. Now you're not just selling to doctors anymore, you're selling to hospital administrators and other admin features of the hospital. So these mega trends interact, and you start to pull out some key macro trends that develop from that. One being that top one there, a shift from the OR to the office or clinic environment. Right? Wherever you can pull cost out of it, provide better outcomes, and do it in an easier setting that takes it out of the operating room, you're going to cut a lot of cost out of that, and that tends to be what people think is going to be the future of healthcare. Shift from inpatient to outpatient. So meaning that if, procedures that are done don't even require an overnight stay in the hospital, continuing that trend to do less and less invasive, make it more inpatient versus outpatient. So if we take that shift from the OR to the office and clinic environment, there are some specific micro trends that are in line with all of those areas. These are essentially where companies are going to place their bets to meet those needs in that future market. So you've got things like robotic surgery, right? More precise incision, less chance of infection, things of that nature. This one's obviously a costly option, requires investment. Miniaturization, right? Making things much smaller so that they're less invasive, require less, open cuts, endoscopic versus other areas. And then the one that's kind of a little more ambiguous but also more scary is alternative non-surgical options. So other things that somebody could come up with that eliminate the need for surgery altogether, whether it's health and wellness and prevention or, a specific treatment with a drug or something of that nature. From these, you can then identify potential disruptions that would come out. So if we take this from the ear, nose, and throat example that we spoke about, they're trying to understand how they should best go into that future market. So you've got things such as you see here. You're going to have, what they call a single-pass device to install vent tubes in a child's ear. So much less invasive, requires one tool versus several tools in a doctor. You simply pull the trigger, it makes the incision, inserts the vent tube, and then inserts the antibiotic through the vent tube in one pass. You don't have to sedate a child, which is a huge advantage, both from a customer perspective, but also from a cost perspective, because it eliminates the need for an anesthesiologist or general anesthesia. However, they've also found that there's enhanced vaccines coming out on the market that are showing the ability to eliminate inner ear infections in children and are eliminating up to 80%. That's going to be a huge disruptor for this particular industry because that not only eliminates that need for that surgery, but it takes it to a completely different industry now. And then there's the emergence of other non-surgical treatment modalities such as hydrofoams or gels that could permeate the tympanic membrane without an incision. So you can kind of see based on a priority, these would all be very disruptive events for that ear, nose, and throat practice, and this is what was prioritized as the highest ones to monitor for. Wanted to make sure we had just kind of a quick overview of that process, how that effort goes into identifying what's going to shape that future market, what are the resulting macro trends from that, and then what are the more tactical micro trends that companies are going to be investing in to try to approach that and meet those needs in that market. and then putting that all together aligned with your differentiation and determining what could be most disruptive to you and your company and your strategy. And from there, we'll shift over now to a little bit more of the meat of this, is really monitoring those indicators and warnings for those disruptors.
Good morning, everybody. This is Pete Grimm. I'll take over from here as we start to talk through the nuts and bolts of how we work with companies to actually monitor for some of these disruptions that we've identified in the earlier phases. So as you noticed on the initial slide, I did spend some time prior to going into consulting in government intelligence, actually. And one of the things that government intelligence does relatively well is a process called indications and warning. So really what that means is it's a series of analytical processes around being able to predict a potential eventuality that represents a threat, or in the commercial context, and when we're dealing with clients now, a commercial disruption in the marketplace. So what it consists of is really identifying indicators that are really quantifiable measures or metrics that we can monitor to predict movement toward that disruptive event. So when we think about warning, there's a couple elements of it, right? So we want to provide a warning to someone who is empowered to make a decision about this, right? So there's an element of communication that's important in this. And it should also carry a sense of urgency. So when we communicate warning around a particular disruption in our market, we want to make sure that we have the appropriate sense of urgency that would compel a decision maker to make a decision or take an action to either deter or mitigate that threat's impact. And so really in warning analysis, we're focusing on the opportunities to counter or alter the path of these potential disruptions. So again, in terms of takeaways, we're talking about, identifying what our core differentiation is in the marketplace, understanding potential eventualities that could disrupt or threaten that differentiation, and then outlining the sequential requirements for a specific disruption. And we'll talk more about what that means here in a moment. But it's really important to understand that there are generally signs or indications that you can discover if you're doing monitoring appropriately that can provide this warning that we want to give to our decision makers. So again, I've mentioned this comes out of some of the work I did in the government. What I've put up here is a slide that was done during the Iraq War, and it's a great example that was obviously shared publicly of how this process works. So this was a slide that was presented to the command in Iraq and also back to leaders stateside periodically throughout the course of the war that was tracking the potential for civil conflict in Iraq. And as you can see, there's a list here of indicators that the intelligence folks had identified that we would expect to see prior to the outbreak of civil conflict in Iraq. And so again, this is periodically reported, and it's important to notice that you can see a couple areas here where we've indicated the change in our assessment since the last time we reported on this. So this is being continuously monitored. We're looking for indications that any of these potential indicators are changing, either getting better or worse in some cases. And then you can see the change in kind of an overall assessment there in the little box on the right, where we have kind of last week we were here and now we're here. And so this is not a particularly happy slide, but it's a good example of how the government does indications and warning. So when we talk about kind of the events that lead up to a disruptor, we'll stick with this same example that Bo led off with this morning, where we're in the healthcare industry looking at ear, nose, and throat space and looking for technologies that could come onto the market, in this case, that could potentially disrupt a standing line of business. And so what we did was basically walk backwards through the product development lifecycle. And so if there was to be a new device that would be potentially disruptive, or as Bo mentioned, some of those non-device treatment options, whether they be drugs or other therapies or vaccines. There's a pretty well-defined process that would have to happen in order for something like that to come onto the market. And it's relatively rigid. Although this is somewhat of a generic example, you can see when a new medical device or a new drug is coming through the development process, initially we're going to expect to see some academic research in this area. And it may or may not be directly relevant to the case that we're looking at or the potential disruptor that we're interested in, but it could have impacts, right? We might see a study published where they've solved a particular challenge from a technology standpoint that could break down one of many barriers to this coming onto the market. So we're going to want to be monitoring that. And we can monitor that if we know where to look and we understand what we're looking for. Moving down that product development life cycle in the 5 to 3 year range from go to market, we would expect to see some IP filings, right? So we expect to see companies filing for patents or trademarks and so forth. Again, those things are discoverable if we understand what we're looking for and are actively monitoring for them. We would expect to see potentially some funding, whether it's M&A activity of a small biotech that gets snapped up by a larger company, or VC funding that's going into a biotech firm that's working on something that's relevant to our particular disruptor. Again, those things are discoverable if we understand the context and we understand what we're looking for. Moving further to the right, you can see, obviously we're going to have a series of clinical trials before any of these new technologies come onto the market. Again, those are discoverable. It may not, one clinical trial that gets published may not give you the entire picture in terms of when or what might be coming onto the market, but in the context of all these other pieces of information, we can start to put together a pretty good assessment of what's coming and when. The same thing for partnerships or strategic alliances that might be happening in the market. And then as we get closer to this new technology coming on the market, we would start to see reimbursement codes being submitted, other regulatory filings, FDA approvals, and so forth, and then marketing activities. Again, all of these things or elements thereof are discoverable to us if we know where to look and we understand roughly what we're looking for. And again, none of these particular pieces of information, whether it's a new academic study or a new academic paper, a patent filing or a clinical trial, it is necessarily going to give us the full picture of what is coming and when. But when viewed in the context of all the other information that we're looking at, we can start to get a pretty good sense. So in this example, the first step after we had been through the process of identifying core differentiators and gone through the sort of trend funnel that Bo described earlier, where we looked at the mega trends and then the mega trends and then the macro trends and then our micro trends, and we got down to particular potential disruptors, we put together a list of indicators, and this is roughly reminiscent of that slide I showed you earlier about Iraq. But if you think about this gives us a very clear and concise way to not only structure our assessment of all the information that we're seeing in the market, whether it be, like I said, academic research or funding or clinical trials or FDA filings and so forth. This gives us a very strong framework through which to communicate our assessment of what's going on in each of those areas to the people that will be making decisions about this. So it's a relatively simple sort of stoplight schema, and we helped the company define some criteria that would indicate whether or not it was routine, irregular, significant, or critical, and what each of those meant within the broader context. And then we can start to put things on a timeline in terms of when we think this eventuality may be likely to come to pass. As we look on to the next slide here, this isn't just an example. There are many ways to do this, but this is one example of how a client of ours chose to format their reporting up to the executive team who would be responsible for making the decision. And there were some, obviously you can see sort of the indicators there on the left that we saw in the previous slide. We see some arrows to describe what the change has been since the last time this was reported. So in this case, this is reported on quarterly. You can see, again, in the top right, sort of our current estimate of when this might come to pass based on all the information we've collected and put into context against each other. The second box there on the top right is our overall risk assessment in terms of how likely we think this is, when we think it's going to happen. The next box down there is what should we be doing now? This is, as intelligence professionals, our recommendation to the strategy team, perhaps corporate development, maybe the C-suite of, at this point, we think this eventuality is still a couple years out, but we should be planning for this because we're relatively confident at this point that this is coming. And then we had a box here where there was some further analysis that would support the judgments that we're putting forward here. Again, really important to have solid data as you go through this because, again, we want that sense of urgency and we want this to be compelling so that decision makers are in the right place to start making decisions or start putting some contingency plans in place. So another important aspect of this is, sounds very doom and gloom. We're talking about threats and all these things that could potentially disrupt our business. But through this process, and again, this is merely a structure through which we recommend companies can do this, but by focusing on that core differentiation, focusing on what's potentially could be disruptive to that differentiation in the market, and then organizing the collection of this information from across your enterprise, almost inevitably, in our experience, there will be certain opportunities that present themselves through the course of this analysis. So they could be, market opportunities where we see this trend developing, and perhaps, during the course of our discussion around differentiation or, potential disruptors, we identify an opportunity in the market that where, one of our differentiators could be put to use or could be leveraged to create an opportunity to get out ahead or to potentially be first movers in a new area of the market. Same thing from a competitive standpoint. Maybe, as we're looking at what our competitors are doing in this space, we're monitoring, this product development life cycle that we've talked about earlier. There could be potential M&A opportunities or partnership opportunities that could present themselves through the course of this analysis. So, this presentation, this process generally is designed to look for, identify, and monitor against threats to our business. But it can also, as almost a byproduct, be very useful in identifying opportunities. So it's important, really important in our view, not to overlook that as a point of value from this process. So as we talk through the next piece of the sort of the last piece of our presentation here, and we look toward questions here in a couple minutes, this sounds like a ton of work, and frankly it is, right? So as we've talked through, differentiation, we've talked through our trends, we've identified disruptors, and then we looked at, how are we going to monitor these disruptors, whether it's, if I'm looking again in the healthcare space, if I want to be monitoring the FDA for potential approvals, or I want to be looking at clinical trials or patents and trademarks or VC movement or M&A in the marketplace, that's a lot to keep track of. And the historic model in competitive intelligence has been to throw resources at it, right? So we need a person to monitor the FDA, we need a person to monitor clinical trials, we need a person within the CI team who's familiar with and can understand the landscape from an M&A or VC funding standpoint. But the reality is, in our experience, most companies already have people who are monitoring what needs to be monitored. They may or may not reside within a formal CI team. They might sit in R&D, they might sit in marketing, they might sit in corporate development or strategy. But generally speaking, again, in our experience, the companies we've dealt with generally already have somebody who is looking at this from a monitoring standpoint. So what we like to talk to companies about is how, rather than pour a ton of resources and people into a CI function to be able to accomplish this, complex monitoring. How do we leverage what's already going on within our enterprise? So that's where this notion of the CI quarterback comes from, and we talk a lot about this when we talk to companies. It's really, somebody who is, generally it can be a single person who is responsible for sort of organizing and managing this from a structural perspective, from a process standpoint, but then can develop those relationships with the other elements of the organization, or with even individuals within those the other functions that can provide the information they need. And how do you sensitize the organization to the importance of the information they're looking at from the strategic standpoint, from the trend monitoring and monitoring for disruption standpoint. So CI quarterback in our mind is really one that is identifying the key topics and opportunities that we want to look at. They direct and engage the rest of the CI team. And again, when we say CI team, we don't necessarily mean a standalone group of people that sit within an office somewhere in the organization. But you could have a CI representative, so to speak, who sits in R&D. And that person, may have a full-time job of their own where they're looking at, potentially they're analyzing patents, they're analyzing IP portfolios, understanding prior art for patents that my company might want to be filing. How do I connect with that person so that I can leverage their work in order to be monitoring within the context of the frameworks we've discussed today? Again, that requires somebody who can connect others and facilitate this effectively. There are always, competing incentives across an organization, but this position really requires somebody that can organize this across a cross-functional basis across the organization, and knows and understands the best tools that can synthesize all of this information into a coherent picture like we've talked about today, and then is empowered to ensure the insights that this work develops are used to further strategic goals. So, do I have access to the strategy team? Do I have access to the C-suite? Can I effectively present, one of the slides perhaps like we've presented earlier, where, our assessment is, hey boss, our assessment is this potential disruptor is about 2 years out. It's based on the following pieces of information. We think this could be tremendously damaging, or we've identified this particular opportunity, and here's what we think we should do about it, whether it be contingency planning or looking at a different scenario from a market standpoint or anything else. So that's really kind of the notion of the CI quarterback. And again, this last slide we have here really goes through how we envision or how we see this operate most effectively in the clients with whom we deal. So again, it's not that legacy model of kind of that standalone CI department or market insights department that sits off by themselves and looks at all this information and is supposed to come up with insights. This is really a networked approach, right? So any one of these people for many of these functions could be designated the CI quarterback, whether it's somebody that sits up in the strategy team or in the C-suite, sitting in R&D or sales, marketing, or ops. Really, it could be any one of these people, so long as they have that skill set that we talked about earlier, where they have the ability to foster these relationships. They understand the broader context. They can get folks pointed in the same direction in terms of the collection of this information and why it's important and how it's going to be used, and then also has that access to the decision makers who can actually do something about it. We do have a couple other slides in terms of backup, but I know we want to get to Q&A here. So just to quickly kind of wrap up with some key lessons. When we talk about monitoring for disruption, we need to start small, right? No company has unlimited resources where they can monitor for all the potential things that might be coming in their market and identify all of those opportunities. So that's where that differentiation conversation really is important. That is about narrowing the scope of what is most critical to my business. How does my business succeed? And it's really important to have a critical discussion around that. And it can be helpful to have somebody from the outside to come in who, as an objective kind of third party, to facilitate that conversation and potentially be a little bit provocative and challenge some of the assertions that Bo mentioned we always hear around kind of table stakes that are thought of within companies as differentiators. So we want to narrow our focus down to our core differentiators and then prioritize our efforts, again, like Bo said, based on the probability of occurrence, the severity of the impact, and the timing, right? And then so this analytic framework is really designed to hone in on those three factors. We want to make sure that we're capturing the opportunities that are identified. Again, I said it before, but it's worth repeating. Regardless of the fact that this process is really designed around identifying threats and protecting the business, it almost inevitably will result in the identification of some opportunities that can be capitalized on. So we want to make sure we're capturing those and reporting out on them. We want to provide recommendations and focus on the so what. So, sitting in a C-suite myself, somewhat at Cipher, if somebody came to me and said, hey, the sky is falling, there's nothing we can do about this. I don't really know what to do about this, but this is terrible. My needle's at red, so to speak. That's not very helpful. So when we identify these potential threats and disruptors, we want to be able to provide context and tell decision makers the so what. Right? What is it that they need to be doing now, or what do we recommend that they focus on now? Do we need to be doing some scenario planning? Do we maybe need to war game our strategy? Do we need are there M&A opportunities that might be presenting themselves? So it's really important to have that so what behind our analysis. We want to assign responsibility and set a battle rhythm. Again, so I should probably define that term. A battle rhythm in the military, Bo and I both came out of the Navy, so forgive the jargon, but that's really about a routine, right? So we want to understand, again, when we look at that sort of spaghetti diagram of all the folks from within the different functions across the organization that have pieces of this pie, we want to have a rhythm around that where we're periodically touching base as a group or individually. What are the expectations for each of those meetings? Who's responsible for what? And there's lots of tools that can be useful to help do that, but without that rhythm, that network is generally not going to be very effective. Contingency plans and alternative strategic options. Again, this is sort of a natural flow-through of this process. So as we're looking for disruptions, imagine being one of those companies on Bo's earlier slide that's looking at this disruption coming into their market. We want to focus on how we can contingency plan and what are the other options that we should explore. That's a whole webinar in and of itself, but those are the action points that we want to be coming out of that. So, and to that end, the last point here is really, okay, as we're looking at this complex picture of indicators, and we get to a certain threshold, or perhaps it's, now we're 3 years away, what are those trigger points where we're going to take some sort of action? At what point, for instance, in our assessment, when we see, the needle move from green to yellow, does that mean at this point we're going to start a contingency planning effort, or we're going to, look at a potential change in strategy? A lot of those can be identified up front so that everybody understands what happens as these assessments evolve and mature. So those are sort of the key lessons that we wanted you to be able to take away, and then I think we've got a couple minutes here set aside for some Q&A, Lakshika, is that right?
That's right, yeah. Thank you so much. At this point, I'll read some questions that have been submitted during the presentation, and we'll try to get to as many as possible in the allotted time. So first question, are there particular technologies that you've found to be helpful with implementing these processes and frameworks?
So I'll tackle that one. This is Pete, and then Bo, obviously, feel free to jump in. I think there are certainly technologies that can serve to facilitate this process. Whether or not it's a SharePoint site that you already have internally, or some of the other more specialized tools, and of which there are several in the market. We obviously have one, as Bo mentioned at the outset, where the key thing in our view is to be able to have a central repository into which each of those pieces of the CI team from across the functions of the organization can collaborate with one another. They can store their information. They can communicate with one another on a regular basis, and can really, the most important aspect of the technology from my standpoint is to be able to justify the analysis that we're presenting, right? So when we get that hard question from the chief strategy officer or the CEO who's, what is this based on, or this particular assessment, where did that come from? Having that ready access to, the data that underlies our assessments of where these disruptors are coming from is really critical. Without that credibility as we go into a briefing around this kind of thing, it's just not going to have the impact that we want it to have. So yes, absolutely there are technologies out there that can help with this.
Yeah, and Pete, I would just add, one of the big things is I always tell companies to try to bring this into what you're already doing, what you're already using to help augment that, right? One of the things I see a lot, especially within CI groups, is they want to bring in, a separate tool that's like the sixth to add to something else, and then they spend the time kind of integrating the pieces of it. So whether it's a data source that you can pull in and automatically upload, and like Pete said, your SharePoint area, whether it's something that's doing it automatically, pulling it all in, the more you can consolidate all of that and do it together in one spot where everyone can collaborate and share and add their own analysis and inputs to it, it'll make this process a lot easier.
Great. So our next question is, what if leadership doesn't react to your warnings?
Well, so that's a great question. As a government intelligence analyst years ago, that was always the fear, right? I mean, you could present the most compelling argument in the world, but sometimes that didn't matter all that much, depending on what was going on at the political level of leadership and so forth. The same is true within companies. As an intelligence professional within your company, in our view, it's your responsibility to be identifying opportunities and monitoring these threats that are out there in the market. It's really, I think frameworks like this can be very impactful in terms of making that compelling case up to leadership around threats and opportunities that you've identified, what the analysis is based on, and your recommendation around what you think the organization ought to do about it. So it can go a long way, in helping build that foundation of credibility, which is so critical for intelligence professionals. But the reality is, it is a reality of intelligence generally that the best we can do is put forward the most compelling analysis possible. There may be, factors of which we're not aware, or it may be that the leadership just decides otherwise. But I think so long as you can confidently say that you've done the best analysis you possibly could and put forth the most compelling communication around that analysis that you possibly could, then I think you've done your job.
Yeah, and I think that's the big piece. If the first question you can ask yourself is, hey, am I articulating this threat and the potential implications effectively? If that answer comes back and you work it and it's still yes, there may be other pieces of information that you don't know about that are driving the decision a different way. But at the end of the day, it really comes down to you're helping reduce the level of uncertainty in that strategic planning process, and that's going to add value regardless of whether they go with a specific recommendation or not.
Great. So we have a time for one last question here. How do you see teams best manage the additional effort required to track these trends and disruptors?
So that's a good question, and I think it goes to sort of that spaghetti slide that we showed. As I mentioned earlier, this is you could easily have a team of 10, 20, couple dozen people monitoring these types of things full time. But I think it really goes to, again, limiting the scope of what you're going to be looking at to things that directly threaten your core differentiation. And then leveraging, again, what's already being done within the organization. So, if you're a smaller organization, maybe this isn't the case. Maybe you don't have folks that are looking at, all of the relevant elements of information that you need already. But again, in our experience in most larger organizations, there is generally somebody or even teams of folks across the organization that are generally already looking at the information that's going to be relevant to this type of analysis. So it really is a question of doing the internal marketing, building the relationships across the organization, demonstrating value to all of the different functions so that they understand what's in it from their perspective, what's in it for them, and then building that network, right, so that you can effectively harness what's already going on across the organization. So, we don't recommend, and we have not seen a need with most of our clients where they need to go hire a bunch of people or invest in a bunch of technology to do this effectively. They can generally do it within the context of what they're already doing. It's really more about using this framework just to better organize and better make it more coherent and more compelling when it's communicated to leadership.
Great, thank you. So that concludes our Q&A segment. Today's webinar was recorded and will be posted for future reference on the SCIP website at www.scip.org, where you'll be able to see the webinar archive. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Pete and Bo for a very informative program today, and thank you to you all for being a part of it. Have a great day, and thank you so much for attending.
Thank you, Lakshika.
Thanks very much, Lakshika.
Thanks, everyone.